How many of you have experienced this? You're watching the news, another climate headline appears. The glaciers are collapsing. The forest fires are raging. And then a scientist appears. They say we're running out of time. And they're right. We are. But now we've listened to the science. And what happens next? We have the path of being stuck or going forward. Why are we stuck? For many, after watching these headlines, it's on to doom scrolling, the act of continuously scrolling through large amounts of negative or distressing news or social media content, often for a prolonged period of time. Even though it causes anxiety, stress, or sadness, people compulsively seek out bad news, even myself. So, what's happening? Well, even in Greta Thunberg, Sweden, young people are stepping away from the front lines of climate activism. Is it because they don't care? No, they don't see a path forward. And why is that? It's because there's active agents that are blocking and limiting our ability to change. So, we saw in the media that it can cause despair. We see politicians pursuing short-term, narrow interests. And even our very infrastructure is holding us back and constraining us. For example, earlier this month, I took a train from Duisburg, Germany, to Rotterdam. It was only supposed to take less than 2 hours. The train was canceled. I tried to take the high road, the green road, but I was punished, essentially. The trip took 6.5 hours, and you could see us waiting for the bus there. At one point, we were put in buses that were heated sardines, an incubator of despair. It's very, very clear that we should take the right choice and make the right choice the easy choice. But here you see I tried to take a train and do the green thing. In Sweden, we have a concept called flygskam, which means the shame of flying. But I'm still being punished for doing the right thing. I said earlier that we have listened to the scientists and that this potentially leads to cynicism and despair. Science is very, very important. But you can see in this headline here, even the scientists are freaking out. They're terrified because some of them don't know what to do. So we should listen to the science, as my fellow Swede Greta Thunberg says, but we have to also do something else. What is it? We have to listen to the social science. What is that? Well, I'm inspired by certain thinkers, social thinkers, who are very, very important. And the first is Einstein. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Here's one of our leading scientists, and he said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, said, freedom begins on the other side of despair. And Michael Lerner, the late social scientist and thinker, said, the problem is not that people lack power, it's that they don't have a sense of how they can gain power. They suffer from a feelings of powerlessness. So we must combine imagination, freedom, and power. And this is what I've tried to do as an activist over several decades. The basic idea here is that we're divided into silos. Activists over here, businesses over here, we're divided. And this breaks down our capacity to act. This is why we're relatively powerless, or one of the key reasons. So instead of having silos, I'm using here the metaphor of magnets. We've got to take these little pieces and bring them together. And what is the key way that we can do that? Well, by designing and creating mega events, we have the capacity to do just this. Several years ago in Washington, D.C., I worked with others, and we created a national town meeting. This was the time of the peace dividend. We had environmentalists, Barry Commoner, peace activists like Seymour Melman, among others, leading members of Congress, mayors of leading cities. And they all came together, they spoke the same language, and it worked. The magnet effect. Fast forward to Sweden in 2009. What happened? Well, we had the environmentalists, we had the business interests, we had political leaders. We had all these different constituencies, unions as well. But it failed. It failed because everyone talked past each other, stuck in the silos. Now, the question for all of us is, as we think about these big delays in climate change, what is holding us back? And part of it is the silos, but there's something else, and that is we simply do not learn from the past. We suffer from what one thinker, Russell Jacoby, called social amnesia. Let me give you a very clear example. In 2018, the Yellow Vest movement arose. It nearly derailed all of France's climate agenda. Why? Well, gas prices rose, and there was a big backlash. People chose economic survival over environmental survival. They were more concerned about putting food on the table than some distant climate goal that could last several decades. So this divorce of economics and environment is part of the silo effect. If you think about green fashion, we have the same exact problem. People, many of them, want to buy green, but it's too expensive, it's inconvenient, or maybe it's not fashionable. So we need to bring these two things together. The question is how? Well, we have to reinvent our toolkit. We have to combine a way to overcome these constraints. And what I propose is something somewhat bold. I call it Climate Activism 3.0 because it has 3 parts. And it's based on what I call USE values, or use values for short. The U stands for universal constraints. What do I mean by that? I mean, we can't have some companies in some countries be dirty and others be clean. It creates an unevenness that perpetuates the status quo and creates problems. A prime example of somebody who understood this is President Kennedy. He understood that if we didn't all disarm, no one would. So we need universal constraints. We can't have some countries arming and other countries not arming. We can't have some companies clean and other companies dirty. We can't have that. It creates imbalance. We do have the example, however, of the Montreal Protocol. That mandated getting rid of ozone. It was mandatory. And the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty heads in the same exact direction. So we do have a current model. Now, what happens when we just have constraints? Well, I earlier gave you the example of the Yellow Vest movement. And what happens is you have a backlash effect. So you can't just have sticks. You must have carrots. You must have incentives. What incentives? Well, this leads us to what's called, or I call, system conversion and cooperation. These are the carrots that make it easier, so you don't have Yellow Vest backlashes. What's an example of this? Well, a conversion process basically gives workers, companies, regions, countries choices. We must give them resources to make the path easier. We can't just have moral grandstanding where we expect people to do things, but we don't facilitate it for them. So this involves retraining, subsidies for innovation. We have to encourage procurement. We have to give income maintenance while these transitions from dirty to clean occur. However, we cannot just throw money at companies. Earlier this year, Northvolt, which was supposed to be Europe's great hope in domestic, in the sense of within Europe, battery production, it failed. It went bankrupt. Why? Because there was just a subsidy, because they didn't integrate the different parts that you need to do to have industrial competence. So the key problem was they didn't have experienced suppliers and manufacturers. In order to be successful in production, you need to have what I call a managerial equation, where you have innovators, financiers, producers, all together. That's the cooperation part. Now, this is a very tall order, to have constraints and incentives, carrots and sticks. That's why we need the third part of USE, which I call ecological mobilization. What does that involve? That involves working with a diverse set of institutions that were all involved in some way or another: universities, unions, utilities, banks, hospitals, cities, religious groups, social movements. All of these institutions have the power that we need to make this transformation. They have economic power, political power, and media power. But as it is, many of these do not function properly. We have to reconstruct and redesign many of them so that we can get the mobilization power that we need. One way to get this mobilization, and it is very necessary because we have to act at the scale and speed that's necessary for systemic transformation, is through what I call economic multipliers. These are systems of acceleration and scale. The first example are cooperatives. In the Basque region of Spain, there's a cooperative involving tens of thousands of workers, and they had an energy project to supply energy, solar energy, for 160,000 persons. In Britain alone, in the UK, 1.5 million people work in cooperatives. So you can see the dynamic where people come together creates a system of acceleration and scale. Next, we have political multipliers. What's happening now is companies are beginning to act more like activists. They're creating transportation systems. They're creating energy systems. The transportation and energy systems are creating constituencies or lobbyists for change. By the same token, as companies act like activists, activists have to act like companies. They have to test out their ideas and scale them. The final element of these multipliers are what I call cultural multipliers. What's a good example of this? In 1970, now we're going back several years, we had Earth Day, and that mobilized 20 million people in the United States. This activist project created a counterculture. The counterculture changed the consumption patterns, and the consumptions built patterns that changed built green markets. So you can see how you can go from activism to green markets. One multiplier by itself will not work. They must be brought together to create the necessary synergies. And here's an example of the mobilization in Earth Day at the University of Michigan, where there was a mass teach-in. Where does this bring us? Well, why do I think that we have change and why that is possible? Well, every one of us has certain capacities. We have a capacity as an activist. We have a capacity as an audience member. We have a capacity as a consumer, a producer, or a voter. But in order to make use of these capacities, we have to act. So Hannah Arendt, the German-American philosopher, said that we don't overcome despair by just being optimistic. We must act, and we must act together. One reason why I know that this change is possible is I did a very rough calculation of the TEDx Europe audience, and I found out that their collective wealth was greater than Spain, less than Germany, maybe on the par of France. So anyone listening to this could be part of a process where we have this systemic change. So we need to come together. I invite everyone to be part of this process, to connect so we can make this happen. So let's go back to the original vision. Instead of watching icebergs and doom scrolling in a heated bus, imagine that you're architects of this future, where you're making use of these mechanisms, working through your local organizations. You're an architect of the future, rather than a doom scroller of despair. I think we have the power. We have only to use it. Thank you.